Melissa Nussbaum Freeman.
Thank you so much, Christy. Thank you, congregation. Good morning. And thank you, worship committee, that put this honor, trust in me to lead the service today. I felt a little tricked. First, I was just asked to speak about May 5th, and I thought, oh yeah, I can say something. And then I was asked, well, how's the service going for you? My opening words, I'll ask you to join me for them in your hymnal. Number 532. This is written by Ernesto Cardenal. And if the men would read the script, the first line, and then the women read in italics, and in the end we'll read it all together. I'll help you start, men. The music of the spheres, our harmonious universe like a harp. Day, night, the going and returning of migratory birds. The mimosa that unfolds by day and folds up again by night. The rhythms of moon and tide, one single rhythm unites atoms to see. And apples that ripen and fall, and in the mine of Newton. Melody, the Lord, our ideals, the heart of the universe, unity behind apparent multiplicity. That is the music. I read a prayer from the poet king Netzahualcoyotl. By any chance, is it true that one lives rooted in the earth? Not always in the earth, here for only just a while. Though it may be made of jade, it breaks. Though it may be made of gold, it breaks. Though it be made of quetzal plumage, it shreds apart. Not forever here on earth, here for only just a while. For the reading today, I'd like to share a legend that I've heard every year since 1985, told by the people of Tepoztlan. It's the legend of their god, pre-Hispanic god, the Tepozteco. The legend, as I know it, goes like this. There was a princess, of course, who disobeyed her father, the king, of course. And she was not to go into the ravine, but she did, and she got pregnant. It was an immaculate conception, of course, by the wind. When the baby was born, the king wanted to get rid of it, so he threw it to the ants. The ants, however, fed the baby crumbs. The king tried to get rid of it again and threw it on the maguey plant. And instead of being stung by the thorns, he was suckled by the sap. One more try, the king threw it into the ravine and it was washed away in the rains. And lo and behold, an old couple found the baby and raised him as their child. The child grew up to be a very clever and handsome young man, of course, and a good hunter as well, and took care of his parents, his adopted parents. Now, close by in the town of Xochicalco was the monster king, Xochicacatl, who demanded tribute from the subjects of his realm by eating them. And he would send out his soldiers to the towns to collect his tribute. Well, when they arrived at the young Tepostecan's house, the young man said, "I will go instead of my father, on one condition, that the monster king, Xochicacatl, swallows me whole." Well, the soldiers didn't see any problem with that, so they said yes, and he went off with the soldiers with his bag. On the way, he collected little pieces of obsidian, which lie everywhere because of the volcano that's nearby. And once he got to the monster king, he demanded that he be swallowed whole. The monster king didn't care. He wanted to eat meat. So he swallowed him whole. Now, the young Tepostecan had told his father, "If I am successful, you will see white smoke. If I am not, you will see black smoke." Well, he's inside the belly of the monster, and he cuts his way out with the obsidian. Comes out whole, covered in blood, and sends up white smoke. Everyone in the neighboring towns know that the monster king has been slayed, and they are freed. They have a big party. All the neighboring kings have all their instruments out. And one very special instrument is the teponashli, which is a log that's hit with sticks. Well, the young Teposteco goes to the party, to the big fiesta, and they see him. He's covered in blood, and they say, "Get out of here." And he says, okay. He leaves, goes home, and puts on his finest robes and his crown of quetzal feathers, and shows up, and the king say, "Oh yes, now please join us at the table and eat with us our finest fares, mole." Well, the young Tepostecan said, "Oh really?" Takes the pot of mole and pours it over his finest clothes. "If my clothes are so precious to you, you can eat them." And he sends up a cloud of smoke and steals the teponashli. To this day, it is said that on special occasions and at night, when the wind is strong in Tepoztlan, we can hear the teponashli. Part of that story ends with a later version of that. The Teposteco, the young god, came down from the mountain and accepted the Christian faith and was baptized, and then invited all the other Tepostecans to become Catholic. I don't usually tell that part. I started writing this talk by randomly asking friends and strangers a simple question. What is Cinco de Mayo? The answers were most revealing. The 5th of May? Oh, like our 4th of July. Independence Day? Wait, usually I'm good with history. No, sorry, I'm drawing a blank. Oh, you know, I'm from Colorado, and it's a great day. Carnitas, Mexican food. Beer, party, piñata. Mexican Heritage Day? My friend Steve was the closest. I know it's not Independence Day. It's a day celebrated in some state but I don't remember which one, and it's for something, but I can't remember what. Steve's a history major. Cinco de Mayo commemorates a battle won in the state of Puebla against invading French troops in 1863, but the war was lost. I'll get back to that later. Poblanos, people from the state of Puebla, it's a state which is just south of Mexico City, do take pride in that battle and celebrate their resistance to foreign invasion, a kind of David and Goliath moment. For the rest of the country, it's a fairly insignificant holiday, business as usual. Cinco de Mayo has nothing to do with Mexican independence. Independence from Spain is hugely celebrated on September 16th. The Mexican Revolution, you know, Emiliano Zapata being one of its great heroes, is celebrated on November 20th, 100 years apart, 1810, 1910. You might say that these two events are analogous to the American colonies' independence from England in 1776 and American Civil War in 1865, but just analogous. So where does this Cinco de Mayo celebration come from? In the 50s and 60s, Cinco de Mayo was used by the State Department, the US State Department, as a way to encourage good neighbor policy. In the 60s, the Chicanos celebrated it to encourage Mexican identity. But it was in the 80s that Corona beer optimized its commercial potential and made Cinco de Mayo what it is today. A party day sponsored by Corona beer, spotlighting easily digested cultural events like mariachis and folk dancing. Now, I drink beer, enjoy mariachis, and I love any kind of dancing. But if we are only going to celebrate the 44.3 million Mexicans living in the US today, why not pick a real holiday, a real Mexican holiday like the Day of the Dead, rich in tradition that predates the arrival of the Spanish conquerors, full of color, symbolism, poetry, theater, food, and humor, a vibrant part of Mexican culture. Why choose a holiday that is synonymous with drinking and hackneyed stereotypes? Who benefits from such a limited appreciation of our neighbors? Is it the same way we diminish other cultures, or simply the other? Carlos Fuentes, internationally acclaimed Mexican writer, wrote, "This, I believe, an A to Z of a life." In the chapter X for xenophobia, he wrote, "We all are subject to the test of the other. We see, but we are also seen. Over and over again, we find ourselves facing the things that we are not. In other words, things that are different. We learn that the only identities that do not change are dead identities. All of us are in the process of being. Nothing can make us understand or reject this reality better than the movement that has increasingly come to define life in the 21st century. The massive migrations from south to north, east to west. Nothing tests our prejudices, our generosity, and our capacity to give and receive in quite the way this phenomena does. The massive migrations. We witness the reemergence of fascism, exclusion, and pogroms, anti-Semitism, anti-Islamism, anti-Latin Americanism. All of them violent forms of xenophobia or hostility, not only toward foreigners, but in a larger sense, towards all that is different. Homophobia, misogyny, racism. In the name of what? The supposed purity of a superior race, an untouchable national identity, a parthenogenic culture that conceives of itself as free of external contamination. An isolated culture will perish rapidly. Nothing, however, brings together the dangers of xenophobia quite like the opportunities presented by migrant labor. We celebrate the so-called globalization process because it facilitates the movement of goods, services, and securities around the world in a truly extraordinary manner. Things are free to circulate, but workers, human beings, are not. The reasons behind migration remain the same as ever. The need to escape local poverty and break the cycle of hopelessness. In today's world, just as before, the migrant obeys the first world economy's demand for workers and the compelling illusion of prosperity. Most migrant workers don't make it to Disneyland. More and more, they are becoming victims of racial violence. The Turkish worker in Germany, the Algerian worker in France, the Mexican worker in Arizona, the black worker in Italy, the North African worker in Spain. No ethical development policy or globalization program can neglect to include in its considerations the protection due to the migrant worker. For that is exactly what he or she is, a worker, not a criminal. The Arizona bill, SB 1070, would try to prove otherwise. Carlos Fuentes goes on. For 500 years, the West traveled south and east, imposing its economic and political will upon peripheral cultures, never asking anyone's permission. Now those exploited cultures are returning to the West, effectively testing the values that the West itself championed as universal. Freedom of movement, freedom of markets based on supply and demand of both workers and goods, and respect for the human rights of each and every migrant worker. Xenophobia obstructs and assassinates life. Abuse, abnegation, enslavement of the other has always been justified by the perpetrator. The other, the oppressor claims, is less than human, less than oneself, not like us. Reverend Peter Morales is the president of the UUA. He wrote A People So Bold. And this is a collection of essays on the future of Unitarian Universalist justice. In the essay, We Are One, Reverend Morales calls us to get some historical perspective on our situation. 170 years ago, more or less talking about 1829, the slave-based economy with huge plantations growing commodities for export expanded westward across the South, but then it hit a border. What is now southeast Texas is prime land for growing cotton. The trouble was that it was part of Mexico. The border was porous, though, and undocumented Anglos poured across, bringing their slaves. They encountered another problem. Slavery was illegal in Mexico. The Anglo immigrants soon fomented a rebellion aimed at legalizing slavery. This, by the way, is not radical wing revisionist history. This is the standard account of academic historians and the version told on the University of Texas website. We need to see a present situation in its historical context. The border between the U.S. and Mexico was created to make space for slavery. The Mexican government had warned that annexing Texas to the U.S. would not be recognized and would be fought, and so it was in 1845. The annexing of Texas brought on the Mexican-American War almost immediately. In 1848, this war ended badly for Mexicans, not only losing Texas, but also New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, California, and parts of Colorado, Wyoming, and Kansas. This is really important because a great part of the pre-American Civil War struggle centers on whether these new states would be admitted to the Union as free states or as slave states. This American struggle ran parallel to the Reform War in Mexico, in which liberals and conservatives fought for the separation of church and state. So you have Americans fighting about whether they're going to have free and slave states, and in Mexico we have the liberals and conservatives. The liberals were saying the state should be free of the church, and the conservatives wanted to replace it with a monarchy, going on at the same time. It took me days to figure this out. The slave states of the U.S. supported the conservative cause in Mexico. The liberal side was supported by President Lincoln, at least philosophically, and they won the war in 1861. The conservatives went to the hills. Enter the French. So let's take a look at Mexico when the French showed up. After these two brutal wars, the Mexican-American War and the Reform War, Mexico is devastated. Its reserves are wiped out, indebted to France, England, and Spain. So President Juarez decides that he is going to suspend payment of the debt for 2 years while the country gets itself back on its feet. Well, of course, the French, the English, and the Spanish send out their fleets. They send them to Veracruz. Juarez goes, strikes a deal with Spain and England. They return to their countries to wait it out. The French, on the other hand, seize the opportunity to conquer a very weakened Mexico. They send in their troops. Napoleon III sends in masses of soldiers, and from Veracruz they make their way to Mexico City. On the way they get to Puebla, where they lose a battle. What day was that? Cinco de Mayo. Okay, so now we know how we got here. So Napoleon III installs his cousin, an Austrian Hungarian Maximiliano, and his wife Carlota as emperor and empress of Mexico. Juarez goes off to the north to maintain his government in exile and to reestablish himself. When he does, They come back to Mexico City, rebel. This is 3 years later. The French Empire is dismantled. Maximiliano was executed, and Carlota goes mad. They send her back to France. I return to Reverend Morales. The land that undocumented Americans in Texas stole from Mexicans was land the Mexican elite, mostly of European descent, had previously stolen from Native Americans. It is easy to determine who has legal right to be here, but who has a moral right to be here? Oscar Liera was one of the great Mexican playwrights of the last 20th century. In his play, The Rider of Divine Providence, Hilario, the town fool, says to a bitter Adela, "Lies, stories. The people don't like the truth, Adela. The truth is like lemon in the eyes. Burns a lot, but after they open more and you see clearer. Watch what happens, Adela. Watch carefully what happens." Bitter Adela responds, "I only see what I want to see, Hilario." Reverend Morales tells us, as a religious people who affirm human compassion, advocate for human rights, and seek justice, we must never make the mistake of confusing a legal right with a moral right. The forced removal of Native Americans from their land and onto reservations was legal. The importation and sale of African slaves was legal. South African apartheid was legal. The confiscation of the property of Jews at the beginning of the Nazi regime was legal. The Spanish Inquisition was legal. Crucifying Jesus was legal. Burning Michael Cerveris at the stake for the Unitarian theology was legal. And it was probably legal for the monster king Xochicalcatl to devour the subjects of his realm. The fact that something is legal does not cut much ethical ice. The powerful have always used the legal system to oppress the powerless. In 1994, natives of Tepoztlán defended their land and community from the construction of a huge golf course and complex, financed by national and international investors. The people of the town took over the municipal government, barricaded the entrance to the town, and held public assemblies not unlike those of the Occupy movement. The town was free of police and crime. One evening, there was a concern that spies and agitators were infiltrating the town and that maybe the celebration of a neighborhood saint's fiesta should be canceled. A heated debate ensued. The whole point of this occupation is to preserve our traditions. The fiesta was held. The golf course and club project was the only one of its kind to ever be defeated anywhere. The legend of the Teposteco made manifest during the 3 years the people governed the town. Tepostecans have been traditionally farmers, but poor returns on crops, too dependent on fertilizers and pesticides, have turned farmers into taxi cab drivers and homes into hotels, mostly for city day trippers. The economy has plummeted while government corruption and drug-related crime has escalated. The gap between the extremely rich and the frustrated destitute widens. People find ways to leave as their options to stay give out. To enter the U.S. legally, people do make the long trip to Mexico City, stand in line for hours in numerous occasions at the U.S. Embassy, fulfill all the requirements, not one of which any American must complete to enter Mexico. to have their visa rejected. No reason. Ni modo, no me toca. Never mind, it's not my turn. They assume it is because, well, maybe because of my brown skin, or for class reasons, or just not the right context. There is today a large community of Tepoztecans in Arizona, a virtual town branch. They're hard workers, carrying out lives as they can. Many are undocumented, maybe most. They live in fear of being stopped, racially profiled, deported, and separated from their children. There are about 12 million people who live with the same fear in the US. Today, our government is hammering out a new immigration system that proposes an ever bigger wall as the linchpin to border security. How big will this wall have to be to protect people from their fears of the other? There is good news, though. On March 4th, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit found that the provisions in SB 1070 violated day laborers' First Amendment right to solicit work on public streets. The ACLU points out that the decision also recognizes that the explicit intent of the anti-day labor provisions of SB 1070 was to drive immigrants from the state of Arizona, not, as the state had argued in court, to preserve traffic safety. It seems simple. When we exclude, we are made poorer. And when we include, we are made richer. Let's skip the celebration of wars, lost or won. Let's celebrate life. Maybe this year, for November 2nd, we could invite one or some of the, what I estimate as 30 Mexicans that live in Provincetown, to help us create our own Day of the Dead altar called an ofrenda, an offering. Maybe my son, a proud Tepoztecan Mexican, could help us. Not to replace our fabulous Halloween, but to be enriched by this tradition, to enhance the legends we live by. Sometimes a Day of the Dead altar has a theme, maybe honoring women from the globe. We could start with 17th century Sor Juana Inés de la Cruz, a first feminist, the 10th muse of Latin America. We could honor those who have passed this year, the 1 billion rising or the 500 Bangladeshi women that perished. United in our shared impermanence and in this, our blessed multiplicity.